Hi, this is Hannah, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. How do stories give new perspectives to conflict and peace? In this episode, we speak with Juanita Velez, a journalist and political scientist. She was the editor of La Silla Sur, a regional subsidiary of Colombian news website La Silla Vacía, focused on covering the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement in southern Colombia. She researches and writes journalistic stories on illegal armed groups, deforestation, and organized crime. She is also the author of A War Later, a journalistic book that tells the stories of 5 Colombians impacted by the peace agreement made between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. The book focuses not just on former FARC combatants, but also tells the stories of victims, military personnel, and government officials that weren't covered in the broader news at the time. We discuss the framework of the peace agreement, the impacts of implementation, and how Velez built trust within communities to facilitate her journalism. Hi, my name is Hannah Balikci. I'm a second-year MPP student here at the Harris School of Public Policy and a Pearson Fellow.
Hi, my name is Paula Cadena. I'm a student at the MSCAP, the Master in Computational Analysis and Public Policy, also here at Harris.
And we want to thank Juanita Velez for coming on to Root of Conflict. Juanita, could you introduce yourself and your work?
Yes, sure. Hi, Hannah and Paula. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Juanita Velez. I'm a Master of Arts student in the Social Sciences Division, and I'm a journalist and political scientist from Colombia. I've been covering the post-conflict in Colombia for almost 7-8 years now, and yeah, that's my main work so far.
Great. For our listeners that are unaware or don't know of all the intricate details, can you describe sort of like the conflict in Colombia, the origins, and describe what exactly the FARC is, its relation to other actors, the origin of the conflict, and why peace was possible in 2016 after 50 years?
That's a very tough question for answering shortly. But, okay, basically, I'm going to focus in the conflict between the FARC-EP and the Colombian state. So basically, the FARC-EP was a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla that was born in the 60s, mainly because of inequality in the land distribution in Colombia. And they became a very powerful guerrilla. They have presence in almost half of the municipalities of Colombia at some point. And they want to take the power, the central power of the state. That was their strategic plan. And since the 60s till 2016, we experienced a very tough conflict and also the emergence of other armed groups such as the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, ELN, or the Ejército Popular de Liberación, EPL, and other guerrillas that make this conflict very complex. So what makes the 2016 peace agreement very important is that it was a peace agreement between the central state and the oldest guerrilla group in Latin America. So that was the main importance of this event. And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of other factors I could mention about the conflict, but this is the main description.
You talk about the origin of the conflict, about the distribution of land, but I think is important to also note, what do you think made it possible for it to be a peace process in 2016?
Okay, so I think that the FARC-EP had a lot of chances to negotiate with the state in the past, but I think that the state wasn't prepared to go to that point. And what happened in 2016 in particular was that the FARC-EP was, as I told you, a very strong armed actor, but towards like the latest 10 years, like since 2015, I think that the tipping point in this conflict was that the FARC-EP was weakened militarily. Since like 2015, they became very, very more weak. A lot of their leaders were caught by the army. They were in a very weak position. So this contributed at some point to put them in a place where a negotiation was maybe a good solution for them. And there was a very intense debate within the guerrilla about negotiating or not. They have a lot of debates around that. But at the end, I think that because of this military position in which they were at that time, the decision was to seek for the negotiation of a peace agreement.
Can you walk us through then? 'Cause I think the peace accords started in Havana, right? There was
Yes.
the conversation between the state, FARC.
It started before,
Yes.
They started before that, and when they started back in Colombia secretly, and when they moved to Havana, it was when the negotiation was out.
Was public.
And, yeah, it was public, and everyone was like paying attention to what they were negotiating. But it started before. To say that.
So publicly in Havana in 2016, but then beforehand. And was Havana was after the referendum, correct?
No.
Okay.
No. So exactly, the conversations start secretly, like in Colombia, but then in 2012 there were some conversations in Oslo, Noruega, and then in La Habana, Cuba, and the peace agreement was signed first in October 2016, and after that peace agreement, there was this referendum in which the government asked the people if they vote yes or no to the peace agreement, because the argument was that there was a huge portion of the civil society, because there was el uribismo, o sea, es que quiero decir como
Yeah.
que
At the end of the day, it was like the referendum was about other things, and part of the society that was with Uribe, the former president of Colombia, they thought that the peace treatment was not hard enough on the guerrilla, and they used that to put everyone against it. Even though they tried really hard, and there was a lot of misinformation at that point, only like 52% or 51% vote against the peace accord, and the other one was like 49.
Got it.
The difference was really small.
Right. So then, in the end of the peace agreement, what were the terms that the FARC agreed to with the state?
basically what they agreed was 10 seats in the Congress. Like the central part of the agreement was, we want political participation. So the government gave them 10 seats in the Congress till 2026. Yeah. And in exchange, they would left their weapons. And this was like the central thing, but obviously the peace agreement involved many other structural reforms, such as the land rural reform and a new policy of drugs and the creation of a system of truth, justice, and reparation, among other things. But the main thing was we want participation, we want political participation in exchange of leaving our weapons.
How do you feel about the advancement of the systems of truth, justice, and reparations now?
I think that the truth system has been one of the great contributions of the peace agreement. Since the peace agreement, there's been a very complex scenario in Colombia. We have a government that was against the peace agreements frontally, and despite having that government, this Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction of Peace, among other institutions, they did their work. They tried to keep going and to do something that we never lived in Colombia. That was first, like, have a contribution of what happened in the conflict, which was the work of the Truth Commission, also like to open this black box around who are the perpetrators and make them accountable, which is the work that the jurisdiction of peace has done so far. And in terms of truth and in terms of knowing what happened to us, I think that because of these transitional justice institutions, we know a lot more about the Colombian armed conflict than before.
Yeah.
I think about that another like important point is that the memory process, like all the things that were working in order to create memory in Colombia, were working from before the peace process, but have been updated, and a lot of information have been like rethink because of what we have learned in relation to the peace process. So it has been like a really positive outcome in that sense, even though we have a lot of things to like improve in that, and there has been situations that have put like a bad taste in the process.
I wonder if this then serves as our transition to your work and like the book Una Guerra Después, a war later, how you started working with former FARC members and interviewing them and getting their information and telling their stories.
Yeah, sure. So part of my work as a journalist was to be the editor of a media outlet that's called La Silla Vacía in Colombia. This is a media that is focused in covering power. And by 2017, I like months after the peace agreement, I traveled to the south of Colombia and lived there for like 1 year or more, covering the implementation of the peace agreement and especially what was happening in some guerrilla concentration camps where the FARC-EP fighters were supposed to let down their weapons. So I started to cover a lot of these processes, not only how the FARC-EP were leaving their weapons, but also how the peasants and how the social leaders were experiencing this transformation of the guerrilla to a political party, and how the victims were experiencing this. And it was all on the ground. So I started talking to many FARC-EP ex-fighters as well as politicians and leaders and victims. And at that point, I wasn't thinking about doing a book. I was just doing my journalistic work. But I then started to follow some of these characters like daily or weekly. Like I started talking to many of them about their emotions, how were they feeling. And at some point, I have like a huge amount of material and like a puzzle of different pieces. And I thought like doing this book was a way like to put these pieces together and to tell the stories of different characters, because this is not just a book about ex-FARC fighters, but also about victims, state officials, and militaries who experienced this process, and how this process changed them, or if this process doesn't change them. But like from the journalistic point of view, I wanted to understand if this peace agreement would change something or not. I thought that this was a very important question, and not just to focus on the armed conflict itself, because we have a lot of coverage about the armed conflict. But the question was, okay, what happened after this process happened?
I don't know if this is like relevant for the interview, but I think it's interesting. We were talking about like you work at the south part of the country, like your main journalistic work has been there. How do you see that region as different from the rest of the country when thinking about the conflict?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So I was very lucky to be in the south of Colombia covering this process, because the south was the region where the FARC-EP was very strong militarily and politically speaking. So that's why I think that in terms of the demobilization of the FARC-EP, this place was very important, like to be in. Obviously, they have power in other places like the Pacific or El Catatumbo or other regions, but their strength, their military strength was especially coming from two blocks, the Oriental Bloc and the South Bloc. Both were very strong when they ended up in the negotiation. So being there was crucial to understand if something would change or not, than being in other places. But what I think the mobilization of the FARC-EP shows is that they have many problems of cohesion, of internal cohesion. So they sell themselves during all these years as a very cohesive armed group. Like we have command, control, we have a secretariado, which was like this big
Like the central
instance.
power.
Exactly, like the central power or instance to took decisions. But what you see after the peace agreement, and this was one of the main findings of the book, and I mean, there's even a commander from the FARC-EP, ex-commander, telling this on the record. He says, like, we were one in Chocó, we were others in Arauca, we were others in the Pacific, we were others in the South, meaning that, yes, they tried to be this national project, and they were big at some point, but they have a very regional and contextual way of operating, and they were not the same in the different regions of the country. And they have a lot of issues of cohesion and control.
What do you hope that by telling these stories of post-peace, the after the peace process, and getting to like the impact of the people, what do you hope that people, either listeners of this podcast or readers of the book, take away from it?
So I think that the main takeaway was, for me and for the readers to take from the book, is like to focus on the emotions of the post-conflict, like to think about what do other people feel about this process. People who lived in these territories, communities, leaders, victims, people who really struggle with the FARC-EP, to know how they feel after. And you have many different answers about that. There were some people that want them to disarm. There were others that didn't want them to disarm. And at the end, they say, we don't want them to disarm, not because we want the FARC-EP, but because we know that the state is not coming. So at the end, there was a lot of interviews that showed how the state and the central state was very weak in many of these territories, and people start organizing themselves just to have a little bit of justice, a little bit of security. So just trying to show this, I thought it was very important. And on the other side, the media coverage of this process at 2016, and I guess a little bit after, was focused on the main commanders and of the chief negotiators of the state. That was like the focus. But what I thought was very interesting too is what happened with the middle rank fighters, what happened with the others, with the most,
base
what happened
fighters,
with the base fighters, what happens with the militias, what is happening with the victims that doesn't have always the microphones to talk in the media, because there are a lot of victims that never go on television or never talk. So at the end, that was my purpose, like to focus on the characters that didn't have the focus during the peace agreement and after.
I would also like to ask you, what do you think is the finding that most excited you when you were writing the book? Like something that you didn't expect. You have talked a little bit about that, but I think there must be something else.
Yes. For me, the fact that the power vacuum of the state let people organized in ways that for me was very surprising to see. And this happens not only with how the community is organized to look for security on their own or for justice on their own, but also how they were, for example, trying to organize to control deforestation because there was nobody doing that. And like the challenges that this power vacuum was making in these regions. Like you have a lot of people that want the peace agreement, but we're expecting the state to have like more presence in these territories. And what you see at the end is that the solution was a little bit more about quantity rather than quality. So you see a lot of military presence in many of these regions, but people didn't want soldiers, you know? They want schools, they want roads, they want services. And what we are seeing right now, which was another finding of the book, is that this power vacuum started to be filled by many armed groups, in fact, dissident FARC-EP armed groups, who take advantage of that vacuum and started to offer these services to the communities. So what you see today is that there are, in some regions of Colombia, the FARC dissident groups open puentes, bridges. They open bridges, or they help construct some of these public goods. And at the end, that's like a huge problem in Colombia, the state capacity. And I think that the book shows in real time how does this state fragility looks in the different regions.
You've said in other interviews that Colombia is a collection of countries, right? For, like you said, the South versus Bogota and the cities, and the Pacific. Think of the La Guajira. Do you feel like the former guerrillas are being integrated to that sense, or to the Colombian society, especially after 8 years? Or like you were saying, is it now this power vacuum coming in from other places? How is this process from the state happening after 8 years? Is there any sort of like continuing work, or do you feel like how do you feel like the integration is happening still after 8 years?
Yes, I mean, what I felt always as a journalist, and that's why I said that Colombia is like a collection of countries, is that somehow there isn't a real conversation between urban and rural places. There's a lot of disinformation about that, and this was something that was very useful for the referendum and the no campaign, because they took advantage of that disinformation. And yes, I mean, what is happening right now and what you see right now is that after the peace agreement, we have a government that was totally against the peace agreement. Now we have a government that has a new policy that's called the Total Peace Policy, and that in their public speech, they say that they want to prioritize the peace agreement, but in the ground of the facts and in the ground of the evidence, you don't see that happening too much. There's like this very sad way of looking at it, and I first was very optimistic, but now I'm not that optimistic about how this peace agreement was like a window of opportunity. And what I feel is that in the last years, the window has closed, at least for the transformations that the peace agreement was like thinking about. That's sad, but that's what you see. Right now I do interviews and I keep doing my journalistic work in many of these places and regions, and what you see is that people is saying that, like, oh, we hope for a peace, but right now we're not feeling that peace.
I think that's transitioning to paz total, or total peace, right? President Petro, he himself was a former M19 member and the first left-wing Colombian president, right? Who's been in power since what, 2012? 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, 3 years this year.
Yeah, and he's been talking about, like, this peace with other guerrilla groups and paramilitary groups. Do you have thoughts like on how possible this is, or Is it an overblown, like how, is it just so much of an idea to have total peace? What are your perspectives on the possibility of it? And do you feel like the communities are receptive to it?
I mean, so far, what you see is that, like the framing of the policy, it sounds good. It sounds good as a framing. Like, we want to negotiate with all the armed groups of the country. But these have a lot of challenges. First, doing that in 4 years, it's very complex. Second, doing all these conversations at the same time and knowing that what happens in one conversation would influence what happens on another conversation, it's very tough. And what you see right now, and I'm speaking at this point just about the FARC-EP dissident groups, which is like my main focus of study, is that since there was this total peace and since the conversations with specifically the Estado Mayor Central, which is one of the main dissident, FARC-EP dissident groups, started, what you see is that they are sort of at this point using the negotiation to strengthen themselves, to gain territorial control in places where they already have territorial control. And so far, you talk with their commanders, and what they told you, not only in private, but also in public, is that they don't want to lift their arms. They are not planning to do it in the short term. They are trying to start a negotiation, but looking at a very, very, very distant future. So, yeah, in the framing, you say maybe this could work, but when you see how it is being implemented, when you see that there are issues of there is no method, there is no strategy, you have many institutions that don't talk between each other. What I feel is that this is not going to happen in these 4 years. And the main outcome so far is that these armed groups are gaining strength because of the total peace.
But then these groups are seeing the process with the FARC and what's been happening over these years, and they can kind of see, like, I think my perspective of it is that if they're seeing what's happening with the FARC, what's their incentive to join the peace process besides the political
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think that their incentive is it gives them time because if you start a negotiation, the state cannot like go and attack you and just try to like take back everything. It's a little bit more complicated than just start a war out.
But I mean, but that was a big difference of the FARC-EP process because they were negotiating. I'm talking about the FARC-EP. Mm-hmm. They were negotiating, and at the same time, they were having military operations. That was a huge difference with this process. What is happening right now is that the ceasefires were given by the state at a very early stage of the negotiations. What you see in the FARC-EP process was that the ceasefires were like after many years of conversations, not starting the conversations. And that has led to a huge debate in Colombia also about when the ceasefires are useful and when not. So, yeah, I mean...
So do you think that, I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of how the learning process from the FARC process, right?
Oh, yes.
Like
yes.
The ceasefires are earlier. Like, what's the learning, I guess, the learnings from both the FARC process and then now into Paz Total, total peace? If other countries were also, I mean, Ecuador just declared the internal armed conflict. Like, if other countries could look at the FARC process and improve it, or even if, like, you know, to look at how it goes, I don't know. What would be your thoughts on, I guess I don't know what I'm trying to ask with this, but whether or not you would if you could recreate the peace process, what would be something you would start from the beginning?
Okay. I would like to answer another thing you asked me before that I think I didn't answer, that is like, why does the FARC-EP dissidents want to negotiate now if they see that the FARC-EP process hasn't been so very successful? I would like to give just one idea about that before. I think that for many of the FARC-EP dissidents, they see themselves as the real FARC, and they are trying to accomplish a better agreement. Despite them seeing themselves as the real FARC, there are a lot of issues about that. Many of the fighters of the dissident FARC-EP dissidents weren't members of the FARC. We have many questions about their motivations, about their ideology, but I think that they do have an emotional incentive to negotiate now, because they want in some point to say that they did a better agreement with the state. If they are gonna nail it, that's another question. Or to achieve that, that's another question. But now, your last question, it's very tough. I mean, I think that there's the peace agreement has a lot of tools that can accelerate any transformation of the country, and I think that the governments that were after the peace agreement didn't take advantage of those tools, and you see it with the Iván Duque presidency and even with the Gustavo Petro presidency. The peace agreement is a very useful tool to transform the territories. I'm not saying it is the only solution, but it was a very big, important starting point. And for any peace process that comes in Colombia in the future, I think that there are the mechanisms in the peace agreement, and there are also lessons about the military strategy, when to use the military strategy, how to, at some point, don't let that the armed groups grow because of your state strategy. That's what we are seeing right now. And I mean, that's what I can say.
There's lots of parts to the peace agreement that, I guess, and correct me, that the government did afterwards, the Duque government didn't put completely. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So about the system of true justice, reparation, and no repetition, we were talking about things that were not accomplished, they weren't used. What do you think is something that should be used and is really missing in the territories?
Yes, I think that what I meant when I say that is that, the system of justice and reparation and truth has been, in my opinion, has done a very good job. Obviously, there are things that they have to do better, but there are other instances of the peace agreement that were very behind, like the land reform or the new policy of drugs, or really changing the political system. That was another thing that was in the table, but it sort of didn't happen as it was expected to happen. But in terms of the system of truth and justice and reparation, I think that there was a lack of pedagogy, lack of So what you see with these findings of the Truth Commission, for example, is that many of these findings weren't socialized in the regions. I know there were a lot of efforts to do that, but in many places, for example, I went to Nariño, Tumaco, just when the Truth Commission report was out, and there were people there that they didn't even know what the Truth Commission was, So I think that there was a problem of socialization of the findings, and at the same time, there's been a lot of people or victims that are not part of the system, and this is not a problem of the jurisdiction of peace, but I think that these institutions emerged in a so polarized context that many victims of the armed conflict between the FARC-EP and the state, they lack the confidence to be part of the system and to get involved and to have the enough confidence to be part of the system. That's a big issue.
Do you think that is factored in due to just the lack of territorial control of the state, the urban-rural divide,
Yes.
the fact that people aren't communicating to one another, just physical barriers, but also communication?
Yes, I think that one of the main challenges, as I was speaking earlier, is the power vacuum and the state fragility. Colombian state is a very fragile state. In some regions of the country, they don't have the territorial control, they don't have legitimacy. So that's very easy for other armed groups or, for other actors to impose their rules. And that's because the state has been so centralized, and the regions of Colombia, many of these rural regions where the FARC-EP was very strong, are regions where the state focus has been mainly military and not... what I always say is that there's like this... In these regions, what you see is that what they feel is that the only face that they see of the state is the military face. So, they come here, the soldiers, and they go. But the armed groups stay, and they become an authority because of that. The Colombian state hasn't learned how to stay in these territories, how to stay and not to stay just militarily, but holistically speaking. I don't know how to say this. The main challenge for the state is to stay in these territories, not only militarily speaking.
And there is lack of confidence in the state in general. So even people that live in the urban areas don't think that their stories are gonna be managed. They have a lot of fear on the government. So it's hard to get them to speak, to get them to actually participate in the system.
I guess one thing I'm thinking is, do you hope then that with this book you can try and build that divide of between people, or like
Yes, part of the purpose of the book at some point was obviously I'm not going to be the only bridge, but sort of being a bridge with these testimonies between these rural and urban contexts, so the people can actually see and read what happened in these regions by the voices of the people, not by me, but by the voices of the people. How do they feel and what were their expectations of the peace agreement? And my main goal was that if you get in touch with the emotions of this transition, if you know what it feels like to go to one of these camps and ask for these fighters to let you return to your land, or to give me the name of my father's or the date of my father's murder, or who killed my neighbor, this kind of emotions that emerged after the peace agreement. My main goal was that these emotions could reach many people and create more conscience about the Colombian armed conflict, because what you see in many of the urban cities of Colombia is that people have a very, I don't want to generalize, but there are some people that have a very strong opinion about what to do with the armed conflict, and you see them saying why just don't we bomb those places? And that's it, And this is because there is a very, what I was telling earlier, there is a huge gap of understanding about what is happening in the regions that face the armed conflict. So my intention was sort of giving evidence, not opinions, evidence, journalistic facts and evidence about these regions, and to make the debate a little bit more fact-based. Obviously based on emotions, yes, but on real and reported emotions of that transition.
Right, and humanizing people in a way. Not that I'd say that I'm, not super familiar, but from the couple Colombians that I've talked to, I feel like there are some people who think of the FARC members or people in rural areas as not I don't want to say dehumanized, but there are other people, right? There's this otherization, or
Yeah, because the thing is that the division between rural and urban in Colombia is also not only a division of rural and urban. Even in the cities, it's you can tell that people have a really different experience as Colombians in Colombia, and because of that, is really like the empathy that we have with each other is really complicated. Right. Sometimes is based on infantilization of people on the rural areas or poor people or whatever the people that are making the decisions want to see. They project on the others.
That's like a very key point. Like, we lack empathy. And at the end, I think that what I wanted to do with the book is to build a little bit more of empathy. Like, if you know what it feels to be kidnapped during 13 years and have the courage to go out of your kidnap and look for your perpetrators and sit with them, and if that doesn't teach you about forgiveness, for example, then what else, you know?
Right.
Like,
yeah. And speaking of that, I think in the urban areas, in the cities, it's really common that we see the conflict on the big numbers, like the number
displacements or killings or
false positives. That is a whole other thing. And we center a lot of our conversation about the numbers and about how the findings have reached those numbers. And that's fine. But I think a lot of emotions can be also said in those numbers, especially because we have seen, I don't know if you remember, but when there was the referendum and they were showing like the population and how they vote in different municipalities, and most of the municipalities that felt the conflict really close, like that they had a lot of killings inside the communities, they were voting like 95%, and that's also an emotion that can be said of that. But I think with time we have lost that. It has become a numbers thing.
And I mean, yeah, the stories that you tell kind of go beyond numbers, right? You can actually get to to the one person in the big numbers, right? You can see the stories, and I think stories are very powerful in building the empathy, like you talked about.
Exactly. The book main focus was to follow 5 characters. I didn't want to go more because it was too much, but I follow 5 characters: one ex-combatant, a women ex-combatant, another FARC APS combatant, a military officer who made intelligence for the FARC-EP, a state officer, and a victim. And through the lens of these 5 characters, sort of follow them and show how was this transition process. And when you focus on their stories, you have many emotional and critical view of this transition, and you sort of connect with lives rather than with numbers. This is not to say that numbers are not important. You're going to see a lot of numbers in the book. But what I try to do is like, yeah, we have these numbers, but let's talk to this person, to this life, and let's see how does it feels to be one of these thousands of kidnappings, or how does it feels to be one of these ex-combatants who is leaving their weapon and who doesn't have any leadership position, and by giving his weapon he is sort of giving everything, and he doesn't know what is going to happen the next day.
I mean, I don't know whether or not you want to talk about it, but I know you collected a lot of like recordings of these people, and you're working on creating your own podcast.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Putting all these materials together. Do you want to talk about that? Or
yes, sure. Yes, so part of the work, of the journalistic work of these regions let me think about another project about the FARC-EP dissidents. I want to focus on them specifically and to explain who are these guys, what are their motivations, and to tell their stories from a journalistic perspective. So part of that exercise started with the book. And because of this chronological following of these characters, I started to interview some FARC-EP fighters, ex-fighters, but also some dissident members, actual dissident members, to explain to the people what are these groups and the history of these groups, because we need to understand these new groups. The FARC-EP, it's over as an armed group, but we have these new FARC-EP dissident groups. They are different from the previous FARC-EP. They have different motivations, and I think that our country needs a debate that is based on evidence, again. So this podcast tries to do that, like to give evidence about these groups and to contribute to the public debate from a evidence-based perspective. And also you're going to find a lot of, again, characters, emotions involved, and things that make you think about, okay, so these guys decided not to lay down their arms. They have even songs about this. I didn't know that, but by doing
there's music involved.
My investigation and our investigation, because this is not just a project of myself, but of the team of my NGO in Colombia, which is called Conflict Responses. We as a team did this podcast with a production company that's called Acorde. We are trying to explain this, and we find that there were songs involved, and there is a lot of useful material to explain the emotions of the fighters right now. How do they feel about the peace agreement? So you find songs where they sort of tell the story of why they decided to stay in arms. And I think that there's a lot of useful material for the audiences to understand, not justify, but understand why we have these groups despite signing a peace agreement in 2016.
One thing that I'm trying to grasp my head around in terms of a question is, what gives you the most hope, I guess, within all of this? Do you have hope? Is there what in terms of all of if this vacuum and being refilled and everything that's happening, what gives you the most hope?
Well, I wish to say that I have more hope. When I started writing this book, I felt a lot of hope, and I tried to make those emotions not get mixed with what I was writing, because, of course, there was a lot of hope at that point. In this moment, I am feeling a lot of uncertainty about the total peace policy, and obviously, I think we all would want our country to pass the page of the armed conflict. But right now, this lack of method, this lack of priority to the peace agreement itself, and the way you're seeing how the armed groups are using the total peace makes me feel a little bit uncertain.
I think that's a generalized feeling back in Colombia. We don't really feel that hopeful. I think a lot of people felt hopeful when Gustavo Petro became the president, because it was a change from what we were used to, and a lot of people vote with that in mind. But after a year and a half, almost 2 years, it's a lot of uncertainty.
He has 4 more years or 2 more years?
2 more years and a couple of months, maybe.
Yes.
It's in August
2026.
Okay. Yeah. Mark your calendars.
Yeah. If people were interested, besides the book Una Guerra Después, which will include the link in the description, but if there's more, people were interested to learn more about either this topic or just in general, what would you recommend people to turn to?
Oh, I think that there's a lot of good work in the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica. The National Center of Historic Memory could be a good source. The Truth Commission has also done a lot of work around the implementation of the peace agreement and the assassination of many FARC-EP fighters, if there's the need to know that. And I mean, the Special Jurisdiction of Peace, they've been also doing a very complex work of gathering thousands and thousands of data from the ordinary justice system and to complement that information with their work. So I think that there's also a useful tool there. I think there are a lot of media right now that are trying to cover not only the implementation of the peace agreement, but the total peace and the armed conflict in general. I could mention Verdad Abierta, Rutas del Conflicto, El Espectador 2020, La Silla Vacía, and yes, there are other regional media that I think that are trying to cover these issues as well as these other official sources.
I guess, yeah, I don't want to end on this, I know that the perspective or the stereotype of Colombia is this conflict. Is there something that you want to talk about that's not related to conflict, or something else you'd want to promote for people to look into?
So there are a lot of good things happening in Colombia in this complex moment. Despite all these things we were talking about, there are many initiatives from FARC-EP ex-combatants that are very worth showing or telling about. They have tourism initiatives. They have a rafting project in the Amazon. They also have textile projects. Many of the ex-combatants of the FARC-EP, despite all of this complex scenario, have been trying to go on with their lives, do things that can cooperate to the society. And we've seen also many acts of truth, of recognition, of forgiveness between FARC-EP and victims. So I think that in the long run, we have seen in these years many hopeful things, but obviously we cannot forget these other things that are happening.
Mm-hmm. I think our final question that we ask every guest is, what is something you wish that we would have asked you? Something that we didn't ask that you were expecting or that you would have wanted us to ask?
I guess I would like to talk a little bit more about some of the characters of the book, mm-hmm. or some of the scenes of the book that are very powerful. But I think that that's good because maybe because of this interview, many people would like to read the book.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Juanita Velez. This episode was produced and edited by Hannah Balikci and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Paula Cadena and Hannah Balikci. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit their website, thepearsoninstitute.org, and follow them on Twitter @PearsonInst. Inst is spelled INST. Thank you.